the book of Deuteronomy, maybe for the first time in the biblical narrative as you're reading right through, makes it extremely clear that there's a tension, and we brought it about. We have a holy God. We have a God of justice. We have a God that must punish sin, who cannot clear the guilty. He says that to Moses. He says, in other words, I can't let any sin go unpunished. He says that in Exodus 34. But at the same time is a God of endless love and endless faithfulness and endless forgiveness and desire for a relationship with us. And it's because of who we are as human beings and because who Israel is, flawed, sinful, that this creates, at least in the book, at this point, a kind of unresolved tension, at least in the minds of the reader. Because the question is, how can this God be, on the one hand, faithful to who he is and faithful to who he is? In fact, David Martin Lloyd-Jones, you're going to hear more about him at this conference. There's one of the sermons he did on revival. He does a very interesting little move. He says that when Moses says, I want to see your glory, God says, no, it'll kill you. But he says, I'll hide you in the cleft of the rock, and I will let all my goodness pass before you. All my goodness. That's an interesting way of putting it. And then just a few verses later, God comes down, Moses is shielded, and it says, his goodness passed before Moses, and he declared his name. And see, this is in Exodus 34, verses 6 and 7. And when he declares his name, he says, I am the Lord, I'm compassionate, I forgive sins down to the fourth generation, but I will in no way clear the guilty. And Dr. Lloyd-Jones says what's interesting is, when God says, I'm going to show you all my goodness, he first says, I am forgiving and I must punish every sin. I am forgiving, and yet every sin has to be punished. And it seems like a contradiction, but the way the doctor put it was this. Why is it that God must punish every sin? Do you know why he must punish every sin? Because he's so good. Because he's so good. I mean, if a judge looked out there and saw somebody doing something wrong and said, oh, well, let it go, that's not a good judge. The reason why God must punish every sin is because he's so good. On the other hand, why is it that God wants to forgive? Why is it that God wants to love us? Why is it that God doesn't ever want to let us go? Because he's so good. Ah, you say, how in the world could there be a God who is that comprehensively good? Either he's going to have to be fully good in terms of his holiness and justice, and only partially good in terms of his love. That means you better obey. He'll be patient a little bit. He'll be patient with you. But in the end, you better obey or you're not going to heaven. So he'd be all good when it comes to holiness and relatively good when it comes to mercy and love. Or you may have a God who is comprehensively good in terms of love. A God who says, well, I'd like you to obey, but in the end, I'm going to accept you no matter what you do. So you either have a God who is good fully in terms of love, but not in terms of holiness, or good fully in terms of holiness, but not in terms of love. But there's no way that there's a God who is that good, completely good, comprehensively good. There's just no way. And that's what this Old Testament scholar, what many Old Testament scholars also said. They look at Deuteronomy and they say, the blessings are so gracious, but the curses are so ferocious. There's no one God that could be both. This must be a redaction. This is one guy who had a more benign view of God, one guy who had a more ferocious view of God, and they slapped them together. No. This is what makes the Bible great. This, of course, as you know, I hope, is the whole basis of the gospel.